It was a cold Christmas Eve in New Orleans, and the air was alive with festive cheer. The streets were lit with colorful lights, and the sounds of carolers mixed with the calls of vendors selling roasted chestnuts and spicy gumbo. Families rushed around with last-minute shopping bags, laughter filling the night. Yet for Zara, this holiday felt strangely hollow. She had moved to New Orleans 6 months ago for work, leaving behind her family in Chicago. The new job was demanding, and her colleagues were friendly but distant. Though she was used to being independent, loneliness had started creeping into her life, especially during the holidays. Zara's apartment was in an old colonial-style building in the heart of the city. It had charm, high ceilings, ornate wooden doors, and a balcony that overlooked the bustling street below. However, her neighbors were often wary of the building. They would whisper about strange things that happened there. Lights flickering for no reason, eerie footsteps at night, and mysterious knocking on doors. Zara dismissed it all as superstitious nonsense, the kind of tales old buildings always attract. On Christmas Eve, she decided to make the best of her solitude. She decorated her small apartment with fairy lights and set up a tiny Christmas tree she had bought from a street vendor. She ordered gumbo for dinner and planned to spend the evening watching holiday movies. Despite her efforts, a nagging unease settled in her chest. Around 8 p.m., she lit a few candles for ambiance, their warm glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Zara wrapped herself in a soft blanket, sipping chai, and tried to lose herself in a movie. Outside, the sounds of the street began to die down as the city slowly went to sleep. The quiet was comforting at first, but as the hours ticked by, it began to feel oppressive. At exactly 11 p.m., she heard a soft knock on her door. It was so faint that she thought she might have imagined it. But then it came again. 3 gentle taps, barely audible. Zara paused the movie, her heart skipping a beat. She wasn't expecting anyone, and it was far too late for a casual visit from her landlord or neighbors. She stood up and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway. The flickering bulb at the far end of the corridor cast long, distorted shadows. "Hello?" she called, her voice steady but low. No answer came. She opened the door slightly and glanced down the hallway. It was empty. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. Shrugging it off as kids playing a prank, she locked the door and returned to her couch. The knocking resumed. This time it was louder, 3 sharp raps that made her jump. She froze, staring at the door. The sound had come from the same direction, but when she checked the peephole again, there was no one there. A cold shiver ran down her spine. "Who's there?" she called out, trying to sound firm. Silence. Gripping her phone tightly, she dialed her landlord's number, but the call wouldn't go through. She tried again, only to find her phone had lost its signal. The Wi-Fi was down, too. Zara's unease turned to fear. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, a soft creak came from behind her. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. One of the candles had gone out. The room felt colder, as if a draft had slipped in. But the windows were closed. She grabbed a flashlight from a drawer and scanned the room. Everything seemed in place. She laughed nervously, trying to convince herself she was being paranoid. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. At midnight, the knocking stopped. Zara thought it was over until she heard faint footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, and coming closer. Then came a whisper, low, raspy, and chilling. "Let me in." Zara's blood turned to ice. She backed away from the door, clutching her flashlight. The voice spoke again, clearer this time. "Open the door, Zara." Her name? How did they know her name? She bolted to her bedroom, locking the door and wedging a chair under the handle. Her hands trembled as she searched for her phone, only to remember it wasn't working. The footsteps grew louder, now echoing inside the apartment. Zara pressed her back against the wall, her eyes darting around the room. The fairy lights on her Christmas tree began to blink erratically, casting unsettling shadows. Then, the whispers started again, but this time they were coming from all around her. "You invited me in, Zara. Don't you remember?" "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't." The lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Zara's flashlight flickered and died, leaving her in silence. Then she felt it, a cold hand on her shoulder. She screamed, but no sound came out. When the power returned hours later, the apartment was empty. The door to Zara's bedroom was wide open, but there was no sign of her. Her neighbors found her phone on the floor, the screen cracked. One final message was typed but never sent. "He's here. Don't open the door." To this day, no one knows what happened to Zara. Her disappearance remains a mystery, but the whispers about the old building only grew louder. Every Christmas Eve, the tenants report hearing faint knocks and soft whispers in the night. Some say it's Zara, trying to warn them. Others believe it's the same visitor, looking for someone new to invite him in. It was Christmas Eve, and the small Montana town was blanketed in a thick layer of snow. The streets were empty, save for the occasional passing snowplow, its flashing lights reflecting off frosted shop windows. Claire, new to the town, had spent the day moving into her inherited farmhouse just on the outskirts. The house stood alone at the end of a narrow, winding road. It was the kind of place one might call picturesque during the day, its old wooden frame dusted with snow, a chimney puffing faint wisps of smoke. But as night fell, the charm turned eerie. Shadows stretched long and dark, and the wind howled through the gaps in the old wooden siding. The house itself was an antique. Built over a century ago, it had seen generations of Claire's distant relatives, though she hadn't known any of them well. She had inherited it from an uncle she'd only met once, at a family reunion years ago. The circumstances of his passing were vague, and the lawyer who had handled the estate seemed in a rush to finalize everything. As the sun set, Claire finished unpacking the last of her boxes. She'd placed a small artificial Christmas tree in the corner of the living room, its twinkling lights adding a warm glow to the otherwise cold space. She wrapped herself in a blanket on the couch, sipping hot chocolate and scrolling through her phone. Around 8 p.m., the heater groaned and stopped working. Claire sighed, assuming it was an issue with the ancient furnace. She piled on extra layers and stoked the fire in the old stone fireplace. The flickering flames brought some comfort, but the house still felt unnervingly cold, as if the walls themselves were radiating an icy chill. By 10 p.m., the snowstorm had intensified. The wind howled against the windows, rattling them in their frames. The electricity flickered a few times before finally giving out, leaving Claire in near darkness, save for the glow of the fire. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, so faint that Claire thought it might have been the wind. But it came again, louder this time, 3 deliberate taps on the front door. Claire froze. The farmhouse was isolated. The nearest neighbor was a mile down the road. No one should have been out in this storm, let alone at her door. She stood cautiously, grabbing the flashlight she'd left on the coffee table. Shining it toward the door, she called out, "Hello? Who's there?" No response. After a moment's hesitation, She moved closer and peeked out the frosted window beside the door. The snow outside glistened under the faint moonlight, and she could make out footprints leading up to her porch. But there was no sign of anyone. Her heart pounded as she slowly unlocked the door and cracked it open. The freezing wind rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine. "Hello?" she called again, louder this time. Still nothing. Closing the door, she locked it and double-checked the windows. She told herself it was just her imagination, maybe the wind rattling the old wooden frame. But deep down, unease settled like a stone in her stomach. At 11 p.m., the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. Claire jumped, clutching the flashlight. She didn't bother checking the window this time. "Who are you? What do you want?" she shouted, her voice trembling. Silence. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. The fire in the fireplace sputtered and died, leaving only a faint glow of embers. The darkness seemed to press in around her, suffocating. Claire turned on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. As she scanned the room, her breath caught. A single handprint, pale and ghostly, marred the frosted window on the inside. Fear gripped her as she backed away toward the hallway. She could feel something watching her, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Then, from somewhere in the house, she heard it, a low, raspy whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was unmistakable, yet impossible to place. It sounded close, as if it were right next to her, yet the hallway was empty. Claire bolted into her bedroom, slamming the door and locking it. She wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. Her hands trembled as she fumbled with her phone, but there was no signal. The Wi-Fi was out too. For what felt like hours, she sat on the edge of her bed, clutching the flashlight and listening. The whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They started in the hallway and stopped right outside her door. "Let me in," the voice said, clear and chilling. "No!" Claire screamed. The doorknob rattled violently, and the chair wedged under the handle creaked, as if something on the other side was trying to force its way in. The shadows in the room seemed to twist and writhe, forming shapes that were almost human. "Let me in," the voice repeated, more forcefully this time. Claire's flashlight flickered and went out. She screamed as the room plunged into complete darkness. The last thing she saw was a figure, pale and gaunt, standing in the corner of her room. By morning, the farmhouse was silent. The fire in the hearth had gone cold, and a thin layer of frost coated the windows. Claire was gone, and the only trace of her was a single faint set of footprints leading out into the snow. They stopped abruptly in the middle of the field, disappearing as if she had been lifted into the sky. To this day, locals in the town avoid the farmhouse, especially during the winter months. They say strange lights can be seen in the windows at night, and some claim to hear whispers carried on the icy wind. It was Christmas Eve in Chicago, a night that should have been filled with laughter, cheer, and the glow of holiday lights. But for Marcus, the evening was nothing short of lonely. Having moved to the city for work just a few months ago, he found himself isolated in a small one-bedroom apartment on the 12th floor of an aging building. Snow fell heavily outside, blanketing the streets in white and muffling the usual bustle of the city. Marcus stared out the window, his reflection faint against the glass, and sighed. He had decorated his apartment with the bare essentials: a tiny artificial Christmas tree, a string of lights taped haphazardly around the window, and a few ornaments that reminded him of home. Dinner consisted of lukewarm takeout from a Chinese restaurant down the block. He ate in silence, the only sound coming from the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. By 9 p.m., a fierce winter storm rolled in, bringing with it icy winds and power outages across the city. The building lost electricity shortly after, plunging Marcus's apartment into darkness. "Great," he muttered, lighting a few candles he'd found in a drawer. The flickering light cast long shadows on the walls, and for a moment he thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Shaking his head, he dismissed it as his imagination and turned on his battery-powered radio. The weather report was grim. The storm was expected to last through the night, with temperatures dropping dangerously low. At 10 p.m., just as Marcus was settling onto his couch with a blanket and a book, there was a knock at the door. It was soft at first, barely audible over the howling wind outside. He frowned, setting the book aside. No one had any reason to visit him, especially not on Christmas Eve. The knock came again, louder this time. Curious, Marcus approached the door and peered through the peephole. To his surprise, a young woman stood in the dimly lit hallway. She was pale, shivering, and wearing a coat that looked too thin for the harsh weather. "Can I help you?" he called through the door. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Can I come in? I'm so cold." Marcus hesitated. Something about her seemed off, but he couldn't leave her out in the storm. Against his better judgment, he unlocked the door and opened it slightly. The woman stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She moved stiffly, her head bowed, and her hands trembling as she hugged herself. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go." "It's okay," Marcus said, though his unease grew with each passing second. "Do you live in the building?" She didn't answer, instead moving toward the radiator and holding her hands over it as if it were emitting warmth. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping noticeably, and Marcus found himself shivering despite the blankets he'd piled on earlier. "Do you want something to drink? Tea, maybe?" he offered, trying to shake the discomfort. She nodded without looking at him. Marcus went to the kitchen, rummaging through his cabinets for a tea bag. When he turned back toward the living room, his heart skipped a beat. The woman was gone. "Hello?" he called, stepping cautiously into the living room. The front door was still locked. He checked the bathroom and the bedroom, but she wasn't there. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. That's when he noticed the frost creeping up the inside of the windows, spreading in jagged patterns. The candles flickered violently before snuffing out, leaving him in darkness. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. A low, raspy whisper answered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have let me in." Marcus spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the room. In the corner, by the Christmas tree, stood the woman. But something about her had changed. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "Get out!" Marcus shouted, backing away. The figure didn't move. Instead, the room grew colder still, and the frost on the windows thickened until the glass cracked under the pressure. The whispers multiplied, surrounding him, filling his ears with unintelligible words. Panicking, Marcus ran for the door, but the moment his hand touched the doorknob, an icy force pulled him back. He screamed as the shadows in the room seemed to come alive, wrapping around him like tendrils. The last thing he saw was the woman's face, inches from his own, her expression a mix of sorrow and malice. By morning, the storm had passed, and the city slowly came back to life. When the landlord entered Marcus's apartment to check on him, he found it empty. The only sign that anyone had been there was a thin layer of frost covering every surface and a single icy handprint on the inside of the front door. To this day, residents of the building tell stories of the visitor, a ghostly figure who appears during the harshest winter storms, seeking refuge in the warmth of human kindness. Those who let her in are never seen again,